Good scaffolding is absolutely essential, even if that scaffolding needs to be done across several class periods. With that in mind, I sought to use two pre-reading scaffolding techniques: building and activating background knowledge and pre-teaching vocabulary, one during reading scaffolding technique, monitored comprehension, and a post-reading scaffolding technique, a group discussion. Each of these techniques helped to prepare my students to read a portion of Anne Hesse's Out of the Dust. The section of Hesse's work that I chose for my students is entitled The Path of Our Sorrow. I chose this particular section because I wanted to teach my students the Georgia Performance Standard SSU SH17B, which calls for explaining the factors that led to the Dust Bowl, and the Georgia Performance Common Standard L9-10RH3, which calls for students to analyze in detail a series of events described in a text and to determine whether earlier events caused later ones or only came before them. In other words, I wanted them to be able to read Hesse's work and recognize how over-farming of the southern Great Plains led to the Dust Bowl. Alverman, Phelps, and Gillis point out that learning occurs more quickly when new concepts are built on what students already know, and when students can personally identify with the lesson in some way. Fitzgerald and Graves point out that a text will rarely have the necessary background knowledge to help students understand it completely, so it is necessary at times for teachers to build their students' background knowledge. Now, my students are Korean high school students with very little background knowledge of American history, so I needed to build their background knowledge on this era of American history before they read Hesse's work. I plan to do this by reviewing some basic facts about the Dust Bowl era. However, at the same time, my students did have background knowledge that I could call on to personalize the lesson. My students live in a province of Korea that is famous for farming and food. In fact, two of my students come from farming families, so they were already familiar with some of the concepts that we were going to discuss in the lessons, such as plowing, even if they did not know the English word plowing. For this particular part of the lesson, I plan to use visual aids, such as pictures from the Dust Bowl era and videos of farmers performing the tasks we would be discussing. Along with activating prior background knowledge, I also pre-taught the vocabulary from the reading as recommended by Alverman, Phelps, and Gillis. Fitzgerald and Graves point out that vocabulary instruction is instruction on words that are new labels for concepts that students already have. For example, again, my students were already very familiar with the idea of plowing, but they would not have been able to recognize it in an English text. So the new label, plowing, needed to be introduced to them. I wanted to make sure that I spent time pre-teaching vocabulary that would be truly useful to my students. So I planned to pair the students together and have them read the text with their partners and search for words that they both did not know. Following this, I plan to review the unfamiliar vocabulary as a class. For the next lesson, we actually began the reading of Hesse's work with the goal of recognizing the causes of the Dust Bowl as she presents them in the text. Alverman, Phelps, and Gillis bring out that comprehension monitoring has proven to be successful with helping students to learn while they read. With that in mind, I plan to use a strategy highlighted in Fitzgerald and Graves called Flag It. In this strategy, students use sticky notes to tag parts of a reading that are significant in some way as they are reading the text. I plan to direct my students to flag all passages of the reading from Hesse's work that they felt related to the causes of the Dust Bowl. Then, as a post-reading activity, we came together in groups to discuss what passages they thought related to the causes of the Dust Bowl, and to outline its development based on Hesse's work. Alverman, Phelps, and Gillis make several suggestions for good group discussions. They suggest making sure that students have clear and manageable tasks, guide them through the tasks through modeling, set limits, set time limits for task completion, monitor and assist group work, have a whole class follow-up so that ideas can be shared, and finally be a good model of cooperative learning. With this in mind, I plan to divide the class up into 2 groups of 4 students, and I planned to assign each group the task of outlining from Hess's text the causes of the Dust Bowl. I plan to model the activity for them by showing how they could use their flagged passages to help them outline the causes of the Dust Bowl. During the post-reading activity, I plan to assist each group to make sure that they understand the task and could complete it on time. The video you are about to see is me pre-teaching the vocabulary from the reading. My students have already isolated the words they did not recognize and are now discussing them as a class. You will notice that whenever possible, I try to do 2 things during the lesson. Direct students to use context clues to decipher meaning, or I use visual images to help them come to an understanding of the meaning of any unfamiliar vocabulary.
All right. Did anyone else have that on their list? Anybody? Okay. Now, what about a second one? Bellies. Bellies. Anyone else have bellies? No. What is a belly? Belly? Yeah.
Mountain and mountain between.
Well, that's a valley.
Valley.
Valley, yeah. Valley's like this. Valley. Like here's the mountain, and then another mountain, the valley. But belly is, what's that? Not a plant thing. Look at how it's used in a sentence. What does the sentence say?
Fill all their bellies.
Fill all the bellies. Fill all the bellies with what? With food. So what's a belly? When you eat, what do you fill? Yeah. Stomach. Belly is stomach. Another word for stomach. So bellies is more than one belly. Swelled. Okay. Now, in the sentence, what does it say? Swelled our wallets. What's a wallet? Well, you carry money in a wallet. So when it says swelled our wallets, what does that mean? Yeah, get rich, make a lot of money. Yeah. Swell. I'm going to draw another picture. Okay. Here is the ground. Okay?
Yeah.
Under the ground is the grass or the plants. When they start to come up, just their little heads poke up. Like that. Like this. That's stubble. Yeah. Also, on my face, the hair starts to come out. This is stubble. Yeah. Stubble. Any more?
I used 2 forms of assessment during these lessons. As a formative assessment of the vocabulary, I had my students do a matching worksheet to begin the second lesson. After each student completed the worksheet, we reviewed the answers as a class, and nearly all of the students had the answers correct. This assessment was necessary because, again, I needed to be certain that the students understood the meaning of the unfamiliar vocabulary before they could continue on to the next stage of the lesson. If they had failed to complete the worksheet correctly, then we would have needed to return to the vocabulary again with further scaffolding support. A summative assessment was used at the end of the second lesson when the students presented their outlines of the causes of the Dust Bowl. This assessment was necessary because it allowed me and the students to make a summarizing judgment of what they had learned. Both of these assessments followed one of the key principles found in Alverman, Phelps, and Gillis for good assessment. They both allowed me and the students to see what improvements needed to be made for future instruction. What I've come to believe about content area literacy is that the primary responsibility of a teacher is to teach students how to process reading themselves. We provide scaffolding support so that the students can learn to provide it for themselves later. Teaching them how to process the content is probably more important than teaching the content itself. Through good scaffolding, we can teach students how to dissect a reading passage and use it in a meaningful way. For example, being able to read a text and recognize the events in that text and whether or not they cause later events. That is how I would define content area literacy, as the ability to analyze a reading passage before, during, and after reading, so that it can be fully processed and then used by the reader for whatever her or his purpose is. When working with future colleagues, I would impress on each of them how beneficial it is to incorporate proper scaffolding of all reading assignments. Not only for their English learning students, but for all of their students. Doing so will allow them to teach not only their content, but also to teach students how to learn on their own.